Good morning. Thank you for choosing to spend a couple of your hours of your Saturday morning with us today. We are going to be giving you a presentation on the Sausalito housing element. And I'd like to do a few introductions here. I'm Lily Shinsing. I'm an analyst in the administration department with the city of Sausalito. I think I know pretty much all of you from the last update. We also have Jeff Bradley here with M Group, the city's consultant. We have Karen Warner from Karen Warner and Associates, also city's consultant. Jeremy Graves, our community development director. We have Dave Javin with M Group, and we have Blaze Syka right here running the PowerPoint. And we also have Damien from the Community Media Center of Marin videotaping. So we're going to post this online for those who couldn't attend the meeting this morning. So with that, I would like to hand it off to Jeff with M Group.
Thank you, Lily. Again, thank you all for coming on this this beautiful Saturday morning. I know there's a lot of other things going on out there, so we'll try to get you through this as quickly and as painlessly as possible. Again, I'm Jeff Bradley with Metropolitan Planning Group, a Bay Area planning consulting firm. We're gonna talk about the 2015 to 2023 housing element and related zoning ordinance amendments. Today's agenda, which hopefully you all picked up at the front. Very briefly, we're going to cover the purpose of this meeting, what we hope to accomplish, background, the many meetings and efforts that have gone into getting us to this point, a quick project overview, which it really has two tracks. Track one is the zoning ordinance amendments that the city is currently looking at to implement the city's existing housing element that was adopted in October of 2012. Track two is moving forward with the next housing element, which will be on an 8-year cycle. And we'll talk about next steps from here, and we'll have time for questions and answers. One thing we talked about we wanted to do to make sure that everyone's questions are answered is at the very beginning of the meeting, go ahead and have people have any questions that they have in the back of their mind, whether they came to this meeting they wanted to ask. We write them up on these boards here, and we try to answer them during the presentation. Also, at the halfway point of this presentation, we'll take a pause. We'll do more questions and answers. And at the very end, we'll also have a Q&A. So hopefully that'll give plenty of opportunity for lots of dialogue. So at this point, is there anyone who has a question or a comment that they want to get off their chest, knowing that we'll answer it either during the presentation or at any of those other two question and answer breaks?
I have a general question. I'm still confused. The state required each city to come up with a housing element, and at the same time I understand there's this Bay Area, ABAC or something along those lines that's talking about high density development along transportation lines and so on and so forth. How are these interrelated is what I guess I'm asking. And what are the obligations of the city to adhere to either one of those or both of those laws?
Good question. We'll definitely cover that. Yes, gentleman over here on the right.
Assuming that the goal was to maximize local control, how would you opt out to the greatest extent possible of these regulations, including, and I'm talking about turning down completely any state funding, obviously staying within the law, but absolutely minimizing the effect on the community, presuming your goal was to maximize local control?
Maximize local control. How would you go about maximizing local control over these types of decisions? Get that one, Dave?
Propose stuff, extra housing units into the law.
So if I may just restate, to make sure we got it correctly, your first question that you'd like addressed is how specific development projects that may occur in your neighborhood or throughout the city interacts with the city's requirements for view protection.
I think all residents would like their views protected to the maximum. All residents would like their views protected to the maximum that is allowed by the zoning laws with which we moved in. You know, we bought our homes, we spent, some of us, 20 to 30 years of our life trying to pay for these homes, and we bought with a specific understanding of the zoning codes so that we had some expectation of the preservation within those codes.
Okay.
And what I'm afraid of is this new high-density push more units in is going to take that protection away.
Sure.
And
Nope.
frankly, I don't want to spend 30 years of my life in my residential nest egg to disappear because of this.
Okay. Thank you. I hear you. The second question was some discussion about the difference between the types of projects and plans that can be approved administratively by staff and other plans or projects that require approval at a public hearing by the planning commission and city
The new zoning
council.
amendments that the
And-
city council is about to approve in their next meeting allows for tandem parking with no specification of any landscaping. So if you look at what is happening in the neighborhoods, when people do that, neighborhoods that had a few bushes, a few greenery,
Okay,
becomes a concrete street.
okay, I'm gonna have to interrupt you there, and I apologize. But at this point, I'm just trying to capture the essence of your questions and boil them down so we can
Yeah.
write them down on paper. We can get into them more later in detail, I promise. I had that down as your third question or comment, concern about landscaping and hardscaping in the front yards relative to some of these new parking changes that are being discussed. Does that capture it? Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. in the front.
I guess I'm a little concerned that it says the amendments required on this first track are summarized, and if we have issues, as Jan does, with one of the, or more than one of these, quote, amendments that are required, that we don't want, is this an appropriate place to discuss that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think probably most people here are opposed to higher density housing, but whether they are or they aren't, I think the big question is, what is the stick to enforce this state statute? And in communities that have not followed it, has there been any repercussions like lawsuits?
So what are the consequences of non-compliance? Yes, ma'am.
Could we get a reminder, at least for me, of what has been agreed to or decided upon in the earlier housing element update on the end into 2014?
Sure.
Just to bring us up to date.
Yes. So clarity on what has already been committed to through the existing housing element. Good question. Thank you. Move it back again.
It's my understanding that the County of Marin grabbed Marin City and used that as part of their housing element. Is that correct? And if they did, why the city didn't turn around and fight a little harder to grab part of that as part of our element? Since Marin City is under our sphere, we do pay for the schools and share with them, the fire and police and so on and so forth. So I'm just kind of curious, was that ever discussed? Or?
We can talk about that a little bit. Marin City, we did get into that in some detail last time around. Mike, you had a question?
We had a situation where some neighbors were building 3 houses down from us, and the notification for the building permits and so forth and the design review only goes out to like a 500-foot radius in Sausalito. I don't know specifically what it is, but it wasn't far enough to where my house was, so I overlooked this building that was being, if they were trying to do design review on, and they put up the
Story polls.
Story polls, thank you. And anyway, I was never notified, although I was impacted the most by that. So I would like to see whatever that radius is for notification for building permits should be doubled. So instead of just having neighbors adjacent, it should go further so that we know about it ahead of time. So we can work with architects.
Public notification requirements.
Yes.
Did you get that one, Dave?
Got it.
So did anyone have a question they didn't get a chance to ask? Yes, ma'am.
How does the housing element fit in with the new 101 corridor expansion plans?
How does the housing element fit in with the Highway 101 corridor expansion plan? Damien, is it okay if I don't use this?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, was the last question referring to the Marin City PDA regarding the 101 corridor? The Marin City PDA?
Does that refer to the Marin City PDA project?
Yes.
What's it?
Yeah, I'm a little confused about that, so maybe you can cover that.
Like in Marin City, there's the PDA.
Yeah, if you,
Yes, sir.
that's a good point. I'm confused about that too. It seems to me that Sausalito has experienced low-income housing for, throughout most of its history now, and we experience it through our schools. So I would like to understand the connection between Sausalito and Marin City requirements, because it seems to me we are, of any community in Marin, we're already getting hit the hardest, have for years. And the existence proof of that is all the private school tuition I've had to pay over the years because there isn't a decent high school or middle school in Sausalito. So I'd like to understand the connection, clearly the connection between Marin City and Sausalito, and why having Marin City there doesn't already cause us to fulfill our requirement.
Did you get that, Dave?
Yep.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty good cross-section of questions and comments. We'll cut it off there. Start the presentation, remembering that at the halfway point, we'll let you know we're at the halfway point, and we can come back and circle back on some of these questions. Next slide, please. So there's really three major things we're hoping to accomplish today. We want to give you a good overview of the housing element, what it is, what its purpose is, what the requirements that come with the housing element process are. Some of you have been to some of these meetings before, and some of you haven't. So we're going to try to bring everyone up to a base level of understanding. Keep you informed of where the city's at now as they work through these issues. And also let you know how to get involved as this whole process moves forward. So the existing housing elements, which I've already held up twice, so I won't again, actually covered 2 cycles, which is pretty rare. Most cities take them 1 cycle at a time. For a variety of reasons, Sausalito kind of got behind the 8 ball and was staring at a 2-cycle housing element to deal with. And because it was doubled like that, the city had to plan for over 370 units. They didn't have to build that many units, but they had to show through their housing element that they could plan for and accommodate that many new housing units within the community, which understandably was a large number and caused a lot of concern in the community. As a result, over 50 public meetings were held over a several-year process. Different staff people, mostly the same staff people, but different consultants came and got chased out of town, and different strategies were tried. We're back again for some crazy reason. But the good news is that big, scary element that had to plan for 372 units is in the past, and it's done. And the community now has the benefit of that. And this new cycle is a lot more manageable, no matter which way you look at it. And the thing that got us through that first go-around with the existing housing element that was adopted in 2012 was really a 3-tier strategy. We've started to refer to it as the 3-legged stool. You take one leg out of the stool, the whole thing falls apart. We had the 3 strategies. It worked. It worked for the community. It worked for HCD, which are the people in Sacramento who get to sit back and decide whether your element complies with a very thick statute of state laws. It's not their personal opinion, but it's their interpretation of state law requirements, which are very strict. So the three strategies were all under the umbrella of low impact. Because as we all know, Sausalito is a special place, it's a special community, it has a special environmental setting. There's a lot of environmental constraints. You have hillsides, you have water, you have bay mud. It's not a place where you let developers go crazy. So we had to get really creative. We have many policies encouraging infill development within existing areas that are already developed, mostly commercial areas. We have ADUs, otherwise known as granny units or second units. They were previously illegal in Sausalito. They just simply weren't allowed. So the city has done a 180 basically and decided that ADUs were a good way to provide small, affordable units that could benefit a lot of people. And mixed-use development incentives for within those infill areas to basically do the old-fashioned style of development. We have a corner store, and above the store you have a few units. Apartments, condos, places for people to live above the retail. And then we get into the scary stuff, and these are requirements that every city in California has to comply with. And there's really no negotiation. So someone asked a question about that. We can definitely talk about it at this meeting, but there's not a lot we can do short of going to Sacramento and changing the laws. So basically, every city in the state has to have these certain ordinances or laws that require a density bonus. It's a state law. Density bonus. The state of California says if a developer proposes a certain number of affordable units, they get a certain bonus over and above what the city would normally allow. They're fairly rare. Most developers kind of shy away from them because it's seen as sort of a confrontational approach with the jurisdiction. And at the end of the day, developers need to cooperate with jurisdictions because they have to go through a whole process from planning approval to building permits to entitlements. And in my career as a government sector planner, the last 20 years in the Bay Area, I've only worked on 1 or 2 density bonus projects. They may get more common, so I don't want to say they're never going to happen. But they are a facet of state law that each city is required to reflect in their own ordinances. And this, by the way, these regulations we're talking about now are track 1 of this process, because the existing housing element has policies that says, yes, Sausalito is going to comply with state law. We're going to have all these new ordinances that all the other cities have. SB 2, that was a Senate bill. Senate Bill 2 requires every city to have an ordinance allowing emergency or homeless shelters somewhere in their community. Basically tells the cities, pick a zoning district. Give us one zoning district. It could be commercial, it could be industrial, it could be residential, but tell us where in your community you would allow these types of uses that most cities, we all know, basically, they don't want. Just go away. We don't allow them here. That's illegal. Can't do that. Reasonable accommodation is, in my view, is really a common sense idea that if someone has a medical or mental disability and they need some relief from the city's normal zoning requirements, that they be allowed to get that relief without going through a whole expensive, complicated variance process. And a lot of this is done at the staff level, and it's most things that wouldn't materially affect the neighborhood. We'll get into that in a little more detail later. Talk about emergency shelters. And then finally, in order to successfully get the next housing element off the ground and take advantage of a provision that allows it to be for the full 8 years, the city has to pass these ordinances. So that's one of the sticks the state has to say, if you don't pass these ordinances, your next element is going to only be for a 4-year cycle instead of an 8-year cycle. And we all know here in Sausalito, we want to do this. I'm speaking as a consultant now. We want, and as residents and as staff, we want to do this as least often as possible, which you don't usually hear consultants saying about planning projects. Can you hold it to the halfway point? Okay. Next slide. So, Housing Elements 101. Some of you probably already have your PhD in housing elements, so I apologize. But for those who are just getting on the bus, general plans basically have 7 major sections or chapters. We tend to call them elements. So the housing element, think of it as a chapter of a big book, which is your general plan. There's actually 7 required elements, but the housing element is the only one that receives this special attention from the state. And it has to meet all these technical requirements. The other elements are really up to 100% to the discretion of the local community, within broad constitutional and legal parameters. The housing element is the only one that gets really scrutinized by the housing folks in Sacramento. And it has these 5 major components that are required. You have to look backwards and say, well, how did we do? We said we were going to plan for 200 units. How many did we build, or how many were built in the community? Housing needs assessment takes a very detailed look at the demographics of the community. It looks at census data, looks at other available data, try to figure out what are the age ranges, what are the economic circumstances of the people that live there, what housing issues are they having, what special needs folks do you have, elderly, single parents. Here in Sausalito, we have a special needs category called Marine workers. And then the third major item is an evaluation of constraints to housing. Because as we all know, in every community, there's constraints to housing. Cities run out of vacant land. They have really high impact fees. They have processing times that take years. They have residents that are vocally opposed to new development. These things are all considered constraints to development. So we have to look at that and say, why would this city build a lot of housing or not build a lot of housing? And so the big one that gets a lot of attention is identification of residential sites. And then you see the acronym RENA. It's like, who's this RENA person? It's actually, the acronym stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And each city receives a RENA that is a projection of the housing need within that community based on a larger analysis within the Bay Area and from the state. And we can spend some time on that later, but I don't want to spend too much time at this meeting because hopefully you'll leave here with an understanding that because of the big RENA challenge we solved with this housing element, which had 2 RENAs of 372 units, our current RENA of 79 is not an issue. So the fight here isn't over the RENA, I hope. Dialogue. Sounds better than fight. And then finally, you have to have a strategy, a series of programs to address the housing needs that were found in the community. And that's really the meat of the document. We tend to spend 90% of the time talking about the RENA, but the part of the document that really lives on is the programs within it that the city says they're going to do to help provide housing at all these different income levels. So we talked about the schedule. In the past, it's been a 5-year schedule. Now, with ABAG teaming up with MTC and trying to link housing with transportation, we're going to an 8-year cycle. And as I've mentioned, it is the one element that gets reviewed by HCD, which is another acronym for Housing and Community Development Department in Sacramento. So that's Housing Elements 101. So back to the RENA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It basically requires cities to zone for their fair share of housing within the region. It's based on the state population growth. The Bay Area, this cycle has about 190,000 units. Marin County has about, all the cities in Marin County together have about 12,000 units. And Sausalito has 79 of those. Actually, I think I got my numbers wrong. Let's put a placeholder on that Marin County number. I think I might.
2,300.
2,300 units. I was wrong by an order of magnitude. Sorry, no heart attacks. 2,300 units in Marin County. So it kind of gives you an idea how these big numbers are allocated at the statewide level, then the county and the cities. So Sausalito's number is significantly lower than it was the previous cycle. The previous cycle, ignoring the fact that we actually did 2 cycles, if you looked at the most recent previous cycle, it was 165 units. So now we're down to 79. The goal is to provide a mix of housing for all economic income levels, from very low income, low income, moderate income, above moderate, and those are all tied into the median family incomes within the area that you're in. This obviously provides a level of socioeconomic diversity within a community. We see a lot of communities that are kind of skewed one way or the other. Sausalito has really a good mix of income levels, which most people acknowledge kind of adds to the vitality of a community. The goal is also to provide affordability linked to the zoning and the density. That sounds like a kind of a vague concept, but we're fortunate in that when we do the planning for these housing elements, we're able to use what are called default densities that allow us to make an argument to HCD in Sacramento that if we have a piece of land that's zoned at, let's say, 20 units per acre, we can make a de facto argument that that land has been appropriately zoned for affordable housing. And the city's commitment has been met. So that's an important concept to keep in mind. And finally, of course, as we're hearing about more and more through ABAG and the One Bay Area plan, there's a big push within the Bay Area overall to bring jobs and housing closer together. And one of the reasons why your number is so much lower than it was before is because there is not a lot of job growth in Sausalito. If you were building big office towers with hundreds or thousands of new jobs, you would see your housing number kind of shoot back up. Because the push is really to move the large number of units closer to those established job centers, where those job centers are expected to have even more job growth, but also have good proximity to transit and major freeway access. So obviously we don't have that here. And finally, the RENA, the number of units you're planning for, it's a planning tool. It's not a building quota. Been sued because they've done it wrong. They've zoned pieces of property under the bay that look good, they look great on paper, but they're not real development sites. They've been sued. Cities with real strict growth control measures that say you can't build more than 50 units a year. They've been sued. And I think it's safe to say that when the cities get sued, because they're just out sort of defiantly in opposition to state law sometimes, they almost always lose, or they settle. And it's very expensive. As part of getting sued, a judge can look at your land use program and say, this is all messed up. I'm going to take away your local land use control. Don't issue any more building permits until you straighten out this mess. That's more rare, but it has happened. And finally, as we experienced under the previous housing element, the RENA becomes cumulative. So if you ignore it, you ignore it, you ignore it, ignore it, you get down over here, finally get sued, you decide to do it, now you're planning for this whole backtrack of housing that wasn't planned for in the discrete chunks that you otherwise could have taken it. Risk number 4 we identified as ineligibility for state housing funds and related infrastructure funds. So a lot of cities used to ignore the housing element in the past on the theory that there was no real sticks, and they figured that the risk of getting sued was low because they were low profile or they didn't have a lot of development pressure or whatever. And so this item has become more popular, if you will, at the state level to say, well, what can we do to get more compliance? So they started tying more and more things to having a certified housing. It became a checkbox item for a lot of grants related to parks, schools, transportation. And so that motivated a lot of cities to say, hey, we really need to do this. And then finally, since this all comes out of Sacramento, and as we all know, whatever comes out of Sacramento is always changing, there's always the potential for new penalties that haven't been actually implemented yet. But the one that gets talked about a lot is, hey, what if we took away their gas tax money? Every city relies on their gas tax, to help pave their roads and pay for road maintenance usually. That hasn't happened yet, but that's the kind of thing where this is all headed. So a quick overview of the two tracks that we're on. There you go.
Is that where you want to build the fire stores?
That's the local character we seek to preserve.
Oh.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So track 1 is the zoning ordinance amendments, which we'll get into in more detail on the next slide. And track 2 is the housing element update itself. And these tracks we're on, if we're able to successfully complete the zoning ordinance amendments, which makes us eligible for the streamlined review for the housing element, which gives us that 8-year cycle, but the deadline for the housing element itself is the end of January of next year, so the end of 2015.
Sorry.
This is track 1 with the zoning ordinance amendments, and this is track 2 with the housing element update. So there's lots of intermediate steps, but just to give you a rough idea, we're seeking to bring the zoning ordinance amendments to the City Council by June or July of this year. These are the things we basically have to do to comply with state law and to implement the commitments within the existing housing element. Parallel to that and concurrently, so you'll be hearing a lot about these same things at the same time, we're bringing the housing element to the City Council before the January 2015 deadline with the goal of bringing it into September, October. So we're not just hard up against that deadline. And this, it's okay. Just for general reference, that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that slide that had all the dates and meetings, because basically every time Lily sends something out to the community, it has that same graphic on there with the 2 arrows, the postcard, the flyers, the emails. We've been putting all that out there. So in terms of the zoning ordinance amendments, there's basically four major amendments implementing the existing housing element. We had 7 major programs within the housing element that get implemented through these zoning code amendments. Can everyone see? Am I blocking? So we have something called, remember in the beginning we talked about infill development and incentives for mixed-use development. The first 2, vertical mixed-use, so now we're drilling down and getting more detail. We have 2 things. We have the vertical mixed-use development, which is encouraging the homes above the stores, the small apartments or condos. And then we have horizontal mixed use. Because one of the issues we found working on the previous housing element, we got to the very end of the process, community, well, I don't want to oversimplify, but we spent a lot of time with the community. Some people were happy, some people were not happy. We spent a lot of time with the council and planning commission, and we felt like we were getting to a point where we could get an approved document. And then we started getting input from nonprofit housing developers. And they were also giving input to HCD, who started saying, hey, you guys got to deal with this. And their issue was vertical mixed use is great. You know, we fully support it. But as nonprofit housing developers, what we really need is some sites where we could do a standalone residential project on both levels, the first level and the second level. So when we talk about horizontal mixed use, picture a small residential development in a predominantly commercial area surrounded by commercial. So we're calling that horizontal mixed use. And that was kind of the final key that kind of put us over the hump and got us to a point where we could get it adopted by the city and certified by the state. There's a small piece, but an important piece. Accessory dwelling units, obviously, liveaboards, density bonus that we've talked about a little bit, multifamily standards. Multifamily standards is basically the idea that if you're going to build a single-family house in a multifamily zone, that house isn't going to be any bigger than what you could get approved as a multifamily development. Whereas before, due to the way the codes were written, you could actually buy a lot that was zoned for 3 or 4 units and build just one really big house.
What's an accessory dwelling?
That's accessory dwelling is a secondary unit or a granny unit or a cottage in the back that you rent to your mother-in-law. Mother-in-law unit is another name for it. But basically a small unit that's subordinate to the main house, either attached or detached. That's a technical question, so I'm going to allow that during this part.
Can I be real naive here a second? You're saying that we can't change these in any way? We're stuck with these?
No, this is just to give you a little context. Within these 7 programs, there's about 4 required ordinance changes, and we'll drill down on those right after this one. And then finally, reasonable accommodations, which is complying with the state laws and the federal laws actually on this one that requires cities to have a mechanism to deal with folks who need a special exception due to medical, either physical or mental disability.
Can you expand on that reasonable accommodations?
I think I have a slide on that. We'll get to that. So the zoning ordinance for VMU and HMU, we've spent some time working with a subcommittee implementing the policy out of the existing housing element, which is part of the general plan, to basically say within your existing commercial areas, a majority of commercial areas, currently property owners or business owners have a choice. If they have an existing second floor, they could use it as office or they could use it for residential. If they want to build a new second or third floor, they could use it for office or residential. This change, this kind of a surgical strike, basically says if you're going to have a second or third floor in the commercial zones, it's going to be residential from now on. And this was viewed as a low impact strategy because it doesn't really change physically what you could build in the community. In terms of views, you have the same issues obviously with protecting views, but it's not allowing additional height, it's not allowing additional square footage, it's really looking at the use and saying within the commercial zones, we as a community believe the best use of that space up there is for residential because it adds vitality to our community, gets more people in those areas providing passive surveillance of the neighborhood for safety purposes, and also, as a bonus, helps us comply with the state laws to get our housing element certified. Well, just let me get a few more. So that's the vertical mixed use. And that applies to a broad range of the commercial properties. We have a map of that, but the horizontal mixed use is even more precise and basically just picks 2 properties and allows for housing development on both the first and the second level. So this slide clearly shows those 2 sites we're talking about. We have 2015 Bridgeway and a 1901 Bridgeway, and also has an address on Esterby. So this one is the little 7-Eleven market just at the turnoff to the Bay Model. And this one's the 2-story office building. It kind of looks like an older motel or apartment building, kind of. So these two sites were, not huge by any standards, but given the context of Sausalito, they were nice, relatively flat, square parcels on corners with good street access. Considered underutilized, which is sort of a technical term for buildings that are either older or smaller, or at the end of their useful lifespan that could reasonably be seen to redevelop in the next 5-10 years. And so these sites were selected to precisely deal with the issue that we received at the very end of the housing element process from some of the public commenters, including nonprofit housing developers, saying, hey, mixed use is great, but due to the very small nature of your sites, it doesn't pencil out for us to do commercial on ground floor affordable housing upstairs. We need a site that could theoretically be all housing. And these two sites fit that bill.
But would these be affordable housing sites or regular housing sites?
We can get to that because that applies to a lot of these, all these sites we're talking about. We could talk about that. Next slide. So the one on the top, it's a 1901 Bridgeway. It shows the little mini market, shopping center and parking lot. And then the one at the bottom, mostly screened by trees, is the existing two-story office building. So the density bonus is an existing state law. We have it here in a binder. And this is one of those ones we're implementing state law. We're following through with the policy out of the housing element. There's not a lot of room to mess around with it, quite frankly. But to give you a general idea, the city already has a density bonus ordinance, but it doesn't square precisely with existing state law. This one will, obviously. It grants density bonuses ranging from 5% to 35%. That 35% sounds like a big number, but the thing to keep in mind in Sausalito is that the sites are so small. We have within the existing housing law, we have a long list of sites that we identified as possibly feasible for future development. The largest of those was 16 units. The two opportunity sites we just looked at with the horizontal mixed-use zoning max out at 10 under your existing zoning. The density bonus is permitted to exceed the normal allowed density, like we mentioned. As part of this process, the applicant or the developer is allowed to ask for 3 concessions, which can include things like building height, parking, or setbacks. And it only applies to projects of at least 5 units. So if someone had a 3 or 4 unit project, that would not be eligible for the density bonus. So the example at the bottom shows a 10-unit project with 20% low-income units will qualify for a 35% density bonus. You round up in this context from 13.5 to 14, that would be a 14-unit project.
In that example, is 10 units assumed to be what complies with the density or zoning to begin with, or how do you come up with the 10 for starters?
Well, the existing ordinance has a maximum density, and that provides the starting point.
In that example, 10 would be
right.
allowed.
Absent the density bonus, 10 would be the maximum.
And where are this? When you're considering all the sites in Sausalito, what are you considering the boundaries of Sausalito? I mean, how far north does Sausalito go for your planning purposes?
We're using the city limits of Sausalito. When we did the original sites analysis for the previous housing on, we literally looked at every parcel within the city of Sausalito.
Cape Cod Road is north.
But nothing in the sphere.
So the Sausalito city limits go from Alexander, the edge of, with the Golden Gate National Recreation Area on the south side, and goes up to Gate 5 Road on the north. So Mike's Bikes is outside the city limits. Marin City is outside the city limits. So this is the city of Sausalito. We're responsible for planning inside the city of Sausalito. The areas outside Mike's Bikes and Marin City are in unincorporated county territory. So the county has jurisdiction there. So we cannot count, nor do we have any land use control or regulations that are applicable outside the city limits.
And Cloudview, up above the freeway, what's that?
That's inside the city limits.
Question though, when I hear this density stuff and some of the other stuff that's presented, and I've been around here for 40 years, and any time we do something in Sausalito, it has an impact in relations to Marin City. Marin City has to be considered as to what the impact is. My question to you is, how much of this would change if Marin City was considered in the housing element and the changes that would need to be made then?
I'm tempted to answer that, but I'm not, because we have it on our list and we're going to cover it at the halfway point. So before we lose track of these zoning code amendments, we're going to get through it. We're almost at the halfway point, and then we can answer those questions. I promise.
Could you adjust that light a little bit?
This light?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Are we allowed to make a comment on what you're talking about there? Or, I mean, there'll be time after, but there are two questions raised that express concerns, and I would like to share something that may address the concern.
Well, that's exactly what I want to avoid, because at the very beginning we wrote down all the questions that people had at the beginning, which this was one of them about Marin City.
Right.
And so rather than having a general discussion about that question now, and totally throwing me off track, I want to get through the rest of the presentation, and at the halfway point, which we're coming to, we will have a more general question and comment, and we can drill back down on some of those. Deal?
Deal.
So this one is in the housing element, and it's also actually in progress right now with the city. And this came out of the issue with the disconnect really between what the city allowed to be built in some of the multifamily zones. From a housing element perspective, you really want your multifamily zones to support multifamily housing. That's the argument we make within the housing element. What was happening, there was actually an incentive for homeowners or developers to buy these lots and just build very large homes. Because under the multifamily rules, you could build more building area than you could on a single family lot. So it actually created an incentive opposite of what you'd want to see under the housing element. So the city's been working on ordinance amendments that would quite simply restrict the size of the house. It would still allow a house to be built on that lot, but it couldn't be any bigger than what you could build on the equivalently zoned single-family parcel. That's in progress. And then the special needs housing. Special needs is a general umbrella term that includes emergency shelters and transitional and supportive housing. These are non-traditional housing types that are difficult for some cities to deal with because they do generate land use controversy within the communities. So these are housing for people who need extra help, either because of drug addiction, alcohol addiction, mental health problems, disabilities, people coming out of prison. You know, these are things that, for reasonable reasons, reasonable people get concerned about. But under the law, we do have to make allowances. So the emergency shelter, as I mentioned in the beginning, requires simply that the city identify one zone within the community that can accommodate emergency shelter. You don't have to build it, you don't have to fund it, but you can't prohibit it through your community through the zoning. And then through the housing element process, the zone that was selected was the public institutional zone. I believe we're standing in the public institutional zone. right now, right?
It
City.
should be more specific.
So this map specifically shows the properties that are zoned public institutional. As the name implies, most of these lands are owned by public entities, such as the city or the state. I believe there's also a PG&E substation, a school site, a ferry terminal, ferry parking, the vacant Spencer Avenue fire station. So these sites are sort of scattered throughout the community. And quite frankly, I think that was one of the appeals of this zone, was it sort of had an equal opportunity effect of putting the entire community on notice that within these zones, the city is complying with state law by saying emergency shelter could be allowed in these zones by right.
Technical question?
Almost. Next slide. We can come back to this if we need to. So transitional supportive housing is required by the state to be treated as other residential uses are. Some cities try to say, well, it's more like a hotel. And hotels are commercial use, and those can only go into commercial zones. So don't go there. So under this program, under state law, you have to treat them as residential uses. And they have to be subject to the same standards that other residential uses are treated to. And so we simply add these uses to the definition section of the code to acknowledge that they exist, define them, label them, and regulates them as a residential use. And the two examples we have here are a rehabilitation facility or an assisted living home for seniors. Single room occupancies are small units, and those are required to be added to the zoning ordinance definition, and these would require a use permit in the commercial zones. These you do not have to treat as a residential use. They can be treated as a commercial use, but you do have to allow them somewhere with use permit. And for this, the city selected the CC zone, which is central commercial, CR, commercial recreational, and CN, neighborhood commercial.
How many units of those do we have to provide?
Those do not have a specific number.
The other cities have specific numbers.
For SROs,
No, for the special units?
it's really a broad, it's not tied to the RENA.
Belvedere has 3 to 7, I think, or 3.
Oh, for the homeless shelter.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do have to accommodate, in theory, within your zoning program, you have to select sites or a zoning district with appropriate sites that accommodate the number of homeless people based on the most recent homeless count, which are typically done once a year by the county. And I believe our number is in the 20s? 20?
Most recent number.
20-ish?
When?
20.
It's not based on the per capita population of the city?
No.
Because, I mean, Belvedere's got 3, and Tiburon, whose population is larger than we are, has 10, and we've got 20?
It's based, every periodically, there is a count of the number of homeless in each community, and so it's a number that may be at this level, in this count, and then 2 years later, it may be at this level, 4 years later, it may be down at this level, so it fluctuates. And so Sausalito has more, at the last count, had significantly more a greater homeless population than Belvedere or Tiburon. And I think we recognize that as residents and business members in Sausalito.
So the zoning, getting back to zoning rights amendments, the reasonable accommodation ordinance establishes procedures for granting these reasonable accommodations. Currently, they're done sort of by policy, but this would actually put that policy in the city's ordinance, which would then comply with state law. The example that we like to use is a lot of people when they first become constrained to a wheelchair, will come down to City Hall and try to get a ramp installed to their front door like this photo shows. And technically that ramp violates the front yard setback. But you don't want to tell someone who just got constrained to a wheelchair that they can't have a ramp into their own house. So this ordinance is meant to address these types of scenarios. It could potentially be more significant. You could be talking about, so on a hillside lot, someone who needs an elevator or a hillavator, to get into a lot that could have potentially more impact to the neighbors or the neighborhoods. But this is really the intent of the law. Fairly minor changes to the existing city's rules that allow someone with a disability to get what they need without having to go through a huge expensive process. And then one of the unique things that the city was able to do with the last element is take advantage of the many liveaboards to help comply with the housing element statutes. And one of only, I believe, 2 cities in the state that is counting liveaboards as housing for the community. The site inventory included liveaboards in 3 marinas. 2 of those marinas require completion of a local permitting process with the city and DCDC to allow counting the units, and the city has a program to do that. Future liveaboards, sort of the expansion potential of this category within the marinas was identified and found capacity for 55 additional liveaboards in 3 marinas. One marina requires a CUP this year to credit towards the marina. So staff is working with the marina management to make that happen. And then update on the accessory dwelling units. The city adopted an amnesty program for existing ADUs, which there were quite a few because they've been illegal for so long, to encourage people to come out and get their units legalized. The site's inventory included 12 amnesty ADUs and 12 new ADUs. Those numbers received a lot of debate and discussion at the time, but that was as far as we could push it with ACD. Currently, this site has 11, but I think we're currently up to 14 amnesty units, so we've exceeded the 12 units.
And the reason there's an increase there is because at the end of this month, the amnesty program expires. So if any of you know of any friends, neighbors who might have an illegal granny unit or accessory dwelling unit, have them come down to City Hall before the end of the month and get their application in so that they can start the process to get their amnesty unit or their accessory dwelling unit, their illegal accessory dwelling unit legalized. We're encouraging this, but there is a deadline on this.
Let's make a deal at City Hall.
Yes.
Come on down.
Yes. So it's a great opportunity. The program's been going on for a year, and have them come down or contact Lily.
What's the requirement for off-street parking?
Rather than get into the details, once you get, we can talk later.
We've already gone through it. We know all about it. And I think there was a misunderstanding.
You have all of these new units being developed out of existing buildings, and what is the environmental impact on it? Our streets, 3 years ago, was a very simple street. Now we have cars all over the place, so
Point of order,
environmental
we
impact
need to
is never
move on with
considered.
it. You just said we can't talk about individual cases, and so we're gonna run out of time.
Would you like to
Public
look that
input.
up on the list somewhere? Environmental
Good idea.
impact.
Dave, can you capture that?
Got it.
Thank you, and thank you. And the final bullet point on this slide, so those were amnesty units. In terms of new 80 units, we have 3 new ones approved and two applications?
4 new
4 new
and 2 pending.
and 2 pending. So we're seeing good production there. And as promised, is the halfway point.
So I have to leave, but I hope that you're going to include on this, and I appreciate the Housing Element Committee very eloquently defining low income.
And I want you to remember me when you have this conversation. I'm a middle school science teacher. I qualify as one of the descriptions of the low-income housing. And keep that in mind when you're talking about that. I have to leave because last night I drove students and sat at Kabbalah Point for 3 hours while they did their mentorship program through the cooking and Eco Top Chef. This morning I was at the Spalding Wooden Boat Center because we are working on developing a boating building program with our 8th graders for engineering. And we're collaborating with the Cascade and Marina to teach sailing. So we're working with the school district. And it's important to have housing for the people who serve this community. Your police officers, your firefighters, your nurses, your teachers. So just think about that, please. And one of the ways that you can get involved, and I'm glad you mentioned the school district, because I've been talking about this for years now, is we can invest in the school district. We are turning the school around. It's my 2nd year at school in Bayside MLK, and I invite you to come and see what we're doing and talk to the new superintendent, Steve Van Zandt. He is doing incredible things. Royce, who is the new principal at Willow Creek, I've met with him. He's amazing. There's no reason we shouldn't have an amazing school district, which would help with some of the concerns about property values and low-income housing. It doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a win-win situation. And now I need to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I was going to say, I still have questions of understanding about the density bonus, and I can do that offline afterwards or in writing or whatever, but I don't understand it. And that example slide, if we built it out a little, might help. I don't know when the time is right.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Could you have them talk louder, please?
Yeah, the last question was a request for more information, either at this meeting or a later meeting, about the density bonus ordinance and how that works.
Could you expand on the plans for the 7-Eleven?
Blaze, can you go back to the 7-Eleven? Maybe the aerial view. So yeah, the 1901 Bridgeway, aka the 7-Eleven site, was one of 2 sites selected through the housing element process to allow for horizontal mixed use, which would quite simply allow for residential uses on both levels, on the ground level as well as the upper levels.
There's no upper level there, so that's what we're concerned about.
Right. Remember,
When you say upper level, you're talking about blocking everybody's site views all the way up the street. So let's just start from that point. Okay.
Keep in mind
discussion.
Keep in mind that when we talk about this site, we're talking about a physical site on the ground, but we're not talking about a physical project at this point. We're talking about making discrete changes to the zoning code that allow or disallow certain things.
But that would resolve
So,
the bill.
can I finish? So currently the zoning code would allow a 2 or 3 story building on this site. No one's suggesting to change that. What this change would allow would be if that building, can you go back to the photo of the building? If that building owner came into the city to request to add a 2nd level, the 2nd level could be residential or office. Under the HMU, also the ground level could also be residential. Obviously, any change to that physical site would go through the city's normal development review process, where things such as views would be taken into account. Yes, ma'am.
But if the developers want to put in a high-density unit with the high-density bonus, then it'll be over 5 units, or 5 units or more, which this is zoned for 10. by your own presentation, they can have 3 accommodations, and one of those is elimination of height limits, therefore view preservation limits. So, I mean, 2 lots right in front of my house are going to be zoned for, on your potential list. So if they came in and say, we want to do 5 units on 1 lot of high-density housing, we want to go up 50 feet, there is no way for us to prevent them. And there's no way for these neighbors to prevent this being forced through as a high-density bonus with view restrictions eliminated. That's the concern.
That's understandable. The thing to the thing to keep in mind about the density bonus law is the applicants are allowed to request 3 concessions or incentives, like you described.
And they request it from whom?
From the city.
From what part of the city? The planning commission,
The city.
or an automatic stamp at the?
These
at the building permit?
these would be projects that would go through the planning commission and the city council.
They do?
Yes. The city council, if they make a finding that any of those 3 concessions or incentives would damage the public welfare or damage the surrounding environment, they do not have to grant them.
There's 2 sites that you've identified, right?
Right.
Ridgeway, 1901 and 215.
Correct.
So this isn't a hypothetical. If a developer requests, if you don't allow them to develop on one of those 2 sites, then the city's residents are going to get sued. So it's not a hypothetical. You're talking about like in the future or whatever. Once these are locked in, so I encourage the people that are here, talk to your neighbors and tell them this is being locked in, and so there's a process of review. These meetings, there should be more people at these meetings to deal with this. If this interests you, you need to be here to address, is this really the only 2 sites to meet this? Because that's a critical location. Get involved.
Go over this and I'll come back to the site. Gentleman at the end.
Yeah, this is a very confusing area in terms of what is, built by right. And there's a big confusion right now, but 2 board of supervisors and members of the board of supervisors came out and said, oh, well, you still have CEQA review, you have all this review. No, you don't. All you have is a design review, and maybe clarify what a design review would mean in terms of the hypothetical that the woman suggested down here about, the height, how high can you go? Because you're saying that if the city determines there is a substantial risk to health or whatever, that kind, you can block it. My reading is they turn around and sue you. Those laws are so confusing. You're dealing with SB 1, SB 375, you're dealing with a whole variety of laws, many of which conflict. And so this isn't, I think I agree with the person in the comment, this is real. This isn't a hypothetical down the road. We are losing local control every time we approve a housing element.
Well, I want to clarify the process that what the process is using the 7-Eleven site. So today we have a single-story building there. Tomorrow, the owner of that building could come in and request that they can request a design review permit to add a 2nd story to that building. What's the process for approval of that design review permit? Notice needs to be given to all neighbors within 300 feet. That's our rules today. The standards that apply, that the Planning Commission uses when it evaluates this hypothetical project I've just described, is one of the standards is that the views are not impaired. I think many of you who are in the audience have attended Planning Commission meetings where the Planning Commission is applying that standard to the building. And we have neighbors come up who say, because the story poles are up right now, I can see that my view is going to be impaired by this building. Planning Commission, you cannot make that finding that approval of this project
will not impair the primary view from my residence. And the Planning Commission is extremely sensitive to those concerns, and it discusses the view impairment regularly at Planning Commission meetings. I was at a Planning Commission meeting on Wednesday night. We had 2 projects there. Both of those projects had view issues, and the Planning Commission spent a considerable amount of time on view impairment. So back to this hypothetical situation I've described. The Planning Commission may say only that you can only raise, the second story can only be on half of the project instead of the entire footprint of the project. That process, okay, so that's the hypothetical of what could occur today. After this HMU regulation is approved, if it's approved in its current form, that process would not change at all. What would be changed by this process is the type of use that can go inside the building. The shape of the building, the design of the building is unaffected at all by the HMU regulation.
Unless they do a high-density project.
One question at a time. Jan, you asked a question.
Unless they do a high-density project. So what I want to hear from all of you here today, including our mayor, is that if a developer comes in with a high-density project, this is not a stamp at planning desk.
Staff.
Planning staff stamp that says high-density project.
That's correct.
You automatically get approved.
That's correct.
What I want to hear, as a guarantee to everyone that lives here, is that high-density projects must have planning commission approval.
They do.
And that height limits will be respected at the current 33 feet.
It's 32 feet.
32.
However, what the state, this is state density bonus law. This is not a law that came from city staff here, came from the decision makers here at the city, came from the consultant. This came from the legislature in Sacramento. And that new law that went into effect several years ago says that developers can request exceptions as part of the incentives. One of those is the height. And so let's continue on this hypothetical example on the 7-Eleven site. So the developer, the HMU in this hypothetical, in the scenario I'm painting here, the HMU regulations have been adopted. And using Jan's scenario, Jan's question here, okay, that developer that comes in there, in addition to wanting to avail themselves of the HMU regulations, also wants to avail themselves of the state density bonus regulations and that one waiver that would allow an increase in height. So say they wanted to go up from 32 feet to 40 feet. That does not affect the view finding that the Planning Commission has to make. So I don't think it would work in that particular situation because I cannot imagine where a 40-foot height would not impair views of residents. And so the Planning Commission would say, no, you can, we will not allow you to have, while you can build up to 40 feet, there is no way you can build up to 40 feet and still not be impairing the views of the residents that are uphill from you. Project denied.
So you're guaranteeing that high-density projects will have to go through the Planning Commission and not be rubber stamped at the building permit desk?
There is, yes, I will guarantee that. The regulation that the change in regulations we are looking at today talk about the standards, what the setbacks are, how many parking spaces have to be provided, these numerical things. We are not talking about changing the process. The process for approval, projects still have to go to the Planning Commission. I, as staff, am not granted approval to or authority to make these kind of approvals. I'm not asking for it. I don't want it. I've worked here in Sausalito for 6 years. I know that's not acceptable. So, yes, sir, in the back.
But you've not put a number on that piece of property.
That number has always been there.
That number has not always been there. That number has not always been there, dictated by the state, and you went along with it by putting a number on it as part of your 372 units that you had to come up with to make your numbers. So now, developer comes in there and says, I want to do this project based on the numbers that you put on it, so on and so forth. Now you've got your arm is behind your back and they're putting the pressure on you. That's a lot different than it was, let's say, a year ago, and the guy comes through the front door. As far as I'm concerned, there was no number on it then before you submitted the housing element. It's a different scenario here. You have one situation before where I've been around planning apartments and building operations for years and years and years. And I don't care what the regulations say, well, you can build up to a certain height. If they want to stop you, they'll stop you. Now, though, you've submitted to the state and said, this site is a special site, we've designated it, it's addressed, the whole thing, and it can handle up to so many units, and we put those in our numbers. That's a lot different scenario than it used to be.
Well, I disagree with you on some facts.
And one other question, just so I got a chance to sneak it in here. When you did the 372 units, did you, any of the properties that you designated, did you use the density bonus to get to those numbers?
No.
Okay, so they were just flat out. So actually then the numbers could go higher on those sites that you designated. If a developer came in and wanted to use the density and got approved. Bonus.
So under today's regulations, in our zoning regulations.
Well, you haven't adopted all the regulations yet, that's why we're here listening about it. So you can implement the 2 cycles.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, it wasn't anymore.
So on using the 7-Eleven site again as an example, it's in a neighborhood commercial zoning district. That neighborhood commercial zoning district allows residences. And so in the inventory that we did for the past housing element, a certain number of residences residential units were allowed on that site. And so by this HMU regulation that we are looking at, you are correct, more residences could be put on that site than are allowed today.
Right. It had the potential before to have so many units. But now, it's not just a potential. You put a number on it, and you've submitted it to the state, so you've kind of rubber stamped it and said, oh, this is more significant.
I disagree with you that we're on your second point there, that we've endorsed it. Our zoning ordinance says that this is the number of units that can be built on that site. Every piece of property in town, every residential piece of property in town has a theoretical number of units can be built on it that is determined by the density standards that are allowed in the zoning regulations.
I'm just saying my experience has been that if you had it prior to designated as a HMU site, that the neighbors could have jumped up and screamed bloody murder, and you probably would have backed down. You're less likely to back down now because you put a number on the property.
I disagree. Well, I disagree with you.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to add to that, because it also touched on a question we had from over here that was on the board in the beginning, and that was about local control. And when I talked in the beginning about planning for the 372 units last time, that was our RENA number, but we actually went well above that number on purpose, and then we called that the buffer to avoid exactly the situation you just described. Because the temptation in a lot of cities is if their RENA is 200 units, they just want to plan for 200 units right on the nose. And the risk of that is as you described, it becomes very critical then how you handle every project that comes in through the door. And if you deny a 20-unit project here that was on your list, you better go find, you as the city, better go find another site to make up the difference, right? We went above and beyond the RENA, so to preserve the local control that the city needs to make the appropriate decisions on these projects on a case-by-case basis.
Do you recall how much you went over and above?
We went 146 units.
Extra.
Yeah. Over here and then back to you. Yes.
I gotta vehemently disagree with your position there, because my understanding is if you've got it zoned for 20, somebody comes in and says, I'm gonna do something eligible for density, you can't say no. You cannot say, oh no, we're not gonna do it. They're gonna turn around and sue you, and they're gonna win. The developer's gonna win. You don't have local control. Once you put it on a housing element, once he comes in and meets all the requirements for density growth, I mean, I've read the law reviews. I mean, the law firms are having a field day with this. And oftentimes, it's the lack of parking. I mean, it's the exemption from parking that's even more valuable than the additional density. So you're saying, well, okay, city retains the right to say no. And I think you're wrong. I think because we've got 3 statutes applicable here, they're all overlapping because you said at the beginning, ABAG is working with MTC. You're now into this whole high-density, transportation-oriented development, and that gives these guys a lot of freeway in terms of what they can get approved and what you cannot deny. So I disagree with you completely about, okay, well, we don't do the 20 here, we can move it to another location. You're going to move it to another location, and you're going to find yourself in court somewhere in Marin, facing a judge who said, the developer says, I've done everything that I required to do, you've got to give me a permit.
I think what we could both agree on is if you got 2 lawyers together in the room, they could find a lawsuit there somewhere.
Yeah, but when
But
you get
in all seriousness, our position as a firm is that the best way to preserve local control for government, and that's the only people we work for, is local government. We don't work for developers. We're working for 25 cities right now as we speak. The best way to preserve local control is to have a certified housing element. Where cities, our opinion, not a legal opinion, our planning opinion is the best way to preserve local control on a project-by-project basis and on an overall basis is to have a certified housing element. And so we can debate that offline, and I respect your opinion, but I like to spread it around a little bit.
Good.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, no, I said I was going to go there.
Okay, then I'm next.
And then you. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated, as I normally am, with the process of community workshops, 2 hours, an hour is taken up in hearing slides, and people raise concerns, and I mean, I feel as though I'm in a vice. I have questions about other part of this plan that doesn't even deal with this thing right here, although I'm empathetic. I don't have time to share my concerns. Unfortunately, I was not able to make it at the first part, but I would encourage let me take a step back. This is important. I was involved in the subcommittee. I wasn't elected to do it or whatever. I was just involved in the subcommittee hearings. Okay, there's been several of them, and I've met with the mayor and the vice mayor and with these people, and they're working these issues. This just these numbers weren't coming out of we're going to make this up, but there's a thorough review, and they've been crunching them. So there's not some kind of diabolical master plot. They've been working hard, but they desperately need to hear the public input. 2-hour public input where only an hour is already taken up isn't enough. We need another workshop to address the issues so that you can take this information and go back and say, hey, is this the best site for these 2? Because I do agree, once you get locked in, you're not getting out. Make no mistake about that. And so this is critical, and we need to have additional workshop, additional input, so I can rant and rave some more.
We will have a second community meeting, and currently we're showing it in May. So stay tuned for that one. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So I have some very specific questions. I was the first house that you put up there that's right behind the 7-Eleven. So you can see our windows right there. The character that you want to preserve, but now you've zoned this thing for something that's going to completely destroy the character of our neighborhood. Right. So my specific question to you, as someone that's employed by me, you're my planner because I belong to this city, I pay taxes, this city has hired you. So I'm asking you, what do we need to do to take this site out of your plan? Because I can tell you that this plan, this location is not going to work for our community. Because you're talking about completely changing the character of this local thing for Spring Street and for Easterby Street and for this particular area of town. So as our consultant, I want you to tell me specifically what steps we need to do as a community to take this out of the plan. And I would like you to address that right now. You're the expert. So tell me what we need to do.
Fair enough. It's a fair question. This is a public process. This is a public meeting. There will be many more public meetings. I would encourage you and your neighbors to attend those public meetings and make your thoughts known. Ultimately, these are recommendations that go to the Planning Commission and the City Council. So obviously, the decision makers here are the appointed and electeds. The Planning Commission and Council will have the final say on this.
Right, but you didn't answer my question. My question was, tell me specifically what we need to do to take this out of the plan. Do we need to meet with you individually to look at alternate sites that comply also within the city? I mean, I want a specific answer. You gave me a general answer, and I appreciate that, but really, you're the expert, so tell me what we need to do.
I wasn't trying to give you a general answer. I was trying to give you a very specific answer because the site is currently in the existing housing element, and this housing element was approved by the Planning Commission and the City Council. And so to change the existing plan, the Planning Commission and the City Council have to agree to that change.
Right, okay, so.
Attend public hearings at the Planning Commission.
Right, so what you're telling me is, as the consultant that we've hired you, me being a person from the city, we've hired you to be a consultant. The step is, we don't meet with you to talk to you about your recommendation for the element that you've already recommended?
That would be out of our scope of work. And I would direct you to the city staff to talk to the
Well,
city
the
staff.
city staff is here, so that's great. So Jeremy, then he's throwing it over to you. Tell me what specifically we need to do to get this out of the city plan.
So that's a good question. So the Planning Commission will be holding public hearings on this. And do we have a time frame for those? So there are going to be public hearings by the Planning Commission on these draft ordinances. And there will be public hearings by the City Council. And so what you would need to do is to come to those, I would suggest starting at the Planning Commission and saying, this is a bad site for XYZ reasons. And then if you're happy with, and then the process for adoption of these ordinances, the Planning Commission holds public hearings on them, and then the Planning Commission makes recommendations on those ordinances over to the City Council. The City Council is the ultimate approval body for ordinances. So I would encourage you to plan on attending public hearings at both levels.
But do we need to request a reconsideration of the plan? Do we
If I were in your shoes and I had held your perspective, I'd say, Planning Commission, please remove this site from the ordinance that's in front
And
of you.
is there something we need to file? Is there some sort of code?
You can write a
section
letter.
that we need to
You can write a letter to me. I'll be happy to forward it to the Planning Commission. We can meet separately to explore this, to explore the process a little bit more. But the short answer is you need to participate in the Planning Commission and City Council public hearings.
Great, thanks. Jeff, I have one more question for you. If we hired you as our consultant, the Easterby Street Neighborhood Association, the Spring Street Association said, Jeff, you're now our consultant. How would you attack this plan? And I want a specific answer.
Honestly, it'd be a conflict of interest to work for both the city and the neighborhood. I wouldn't be able to take that engagement.
Well, then who would you recommend?
Maybe we take.
I would like an answer for all of us, because we're all here. You work for me. You may have been hired by the city, but I pay taxes, and I expect you to also look at my interests and answer my questions.
I'd rather not answer the question. Thank you. With that, I'd like to conclude the questions and get through. We only have 15 more minutes. I'd like to get through the last half of the presentation very quickly, and then stick around as long as necessary to answer any individual questions.
This indicates that there's a city council meeting before the planning commission meeting. What's the point of that city council meeting?
They're going to vote on it.
Right. So why are we not?
It's an update. It's an update to the council about this community meeting here.
You're not going to vote on it? But the last
Not at the
council
not at the next council meeting.
They said they were going to vote on it.
Not at the next council meeting.
The next step after here is the staff will be reporting to the City Council what the discussion that has taken place today, so that the City Council is kept up abreast of the dialogue that we're having. And then after that, based upon City Council direction, we will be initiating hearings at the Planning Commission.
So I'd like to turn it over to Karen Warner. She's going to very quickly take you through Track 2, the housing element update itself, for the next 8-year planning cycle, and then I'll stick around as long as necessary to answer any other questions. Thank you. I hope so.
I'm going to start by letting this lady ask her question because I saw her.
Yeah, I was kind of frustrated because a lot of
Quickly.
people spoke multiple times.
Okay.
You mentioned very briefly a 16 unit as being the major, yeah, I heard you say something about a 16 unit housing approved, and where is that addressed?
Yeah, that was our largest site, and that was the Butte Avenue site that is now officially off the list because there's a movement to preserve it as open space. Actually, it came up.
I was involved in that. That's.
Oh, it's on.
It's on its way.
It's on the existing. It's on the list with the existing housing element. For the new housing element, it'll come off the list.
What happened with the 1757 Bridgeway, with the 3 abandoned houses? What happened with that site?
We have a
Why don't
project.
In brief, we've received a development application for it. We can talk about that. Why don't we let Karen proceed with her application? But you're asking a good question. We'll talk about that at the end.
I won't proceed with my
Don't
application.
let me go without talking about it.
This will not be the second half. This will be about 10 minutes, but Blaise. So Jeff has gone through this. These are the major components to the housing element, and as we talked about, the importance of having a state-approved element for various reasons. The number one reason is protection from litigation. We talked about the RHNA. And this slide shows the detailed numbers. You can see that in the prior RHNA allocation, the 2007 through 2014, the Bay Area's, which is ABAG, RHNA was 214,000. It's now decreased to 187,000. Sausalito has decreased from 165 to 79. So that's where we need to demonstrate adequate sites to meet 79 additional units. Next slide.
To be able to accommodate.
To accommodate. Do I have a pointer, Jeff? Thank you. So just in a little bit more detail on what the RHNA is and the income breakdowns. We're looking at this in terms of a 2-person household size. So a very low income household makes $45,000, a low income household makes up to $72,000, and a moderate income household makes almost $100,000. The RHNA of 79 units is divided into these 4 income categories. And as Jeff mentioned, now the state statutes allow us to use default densities when we're looking at the adequacy of sites to meet these various income categories. So the default density for Sausalito as a small community is 20 units an acre. So that's where we have our infill sites in the commercial districts that accommodate 20 units an acre that we can credit towards the very low and low. The moderate income is a 12 unit in an acre, and so many of the city's multifamily districts fall into that category. The important takeaway is there's no rezoning or any adjustment required to the sites inventory in your adopted element to address the city's RHNA. What is affordable housing? It's not necessarily high-density housing. So the 3 legs of the stool that Jeff talked about, infill is one of those legs. So that's where we're talking about the 20 unit an acre density. The other 2 legs are liveaboards and accessory dwelling units. Those don't meet a density minimum, but those do, through our rent analysis, provide important affordable housing in Sausalito. Affordable housing serves all different types of households: families, seniors, people with disabilities, marine workers. It's developed by private developers, typically nonprofits, and that's where we're talking about deed-restricted affordable housing. but there's market rate affordable housing. So as I'm mentioning, the secondary dwelling units, by their very nature, by their very size, are affordable. The liveaboards, by their very nature, are affordable. Some of your older apartment complexes, the rents are at a level that are affordable at the moderate and some even at the low income level. So it's not necessary, when we say affordable housing, you always need to be careful. It might not be subsidized, and you need to look at what level you're referring to. The focus of affordable housing, and the city of Sausalito has 3 subsidized affordable projects, all 3 of which are very small scale. They're all for seniors. They fit very well within the neighborhood context. And that's really, when you think of, what will affordable housing be like in Sausalito in the future, in addition to the second units and the liveaboards, we're talking about a certain percentage of units that would go within your commercial district. So in the vertical mixed use regulations, where now the second story will need to be residential, 1 unit needs to be affordable. So you've got, 4 units being built on top, 1 will be affordable. No one's really going to know the difference, and that's really the low impact strategy. On the horizontal mixed use sites, where they're able to do, if the developer chooses to do the ground floor residential, there is a requirement that 50% of the units be affordable. So you'll get, a greater affordability. Next. Demographic trends, very interesting in Sausalito. You actually saw a population decrease over the past 10 years, even while you had a little bit of housing growth. It's because your household size is getting smaller, your population's aging, your families are decreasing, families with kids. And you have a really, really significant number of single-person households. So we look at all of these trends and we say, what does this mean in terms of housing needs? And all this work, as the gentleman said, really occurred in the last element. And since that was done so recently, we're just, really fine-tuning at this point. So what we looked at is smaller units close to transit. So the idea of commercial infill works perfectly with that. The accessory dwelling units, senior housing, and then the opportunities for family housing. The horizontal mixed use includes a component where a certain percentage of the units would need to be for families, so for 2 and 3 bedroom units. The housing element looks at a variety of special needs households. Just in a nutshell, a quarter of Sausalito's households are senior citizens. A quarter of those seniors are actually renters. A large number of your senior homeowners are living alone. So what does that mean in terms of allowing seniors to remain in their homes as they age? And a third of your seniors are low income. So this is the largest special needs group in your community and a large focus of the housing element. 16% of Sausalito's population has disabilities, and 40% of those with disabilities are low income. So this is another very important need in the community. Marine workers is a very important part of Sausalito's history, predominantly lower income population. Many of the marine workers are residing on liveaboards, and a big focus of the housing element has been bringing the liveaboards that are kind of, have been approved by the BCDC authority, but not officially in the city's housing stock, bringing them into the city's housing stock and making sure that they have the type of services that are needed for people living full time. Next. Housing costs, in a nutshell, as I'm sure you're aware, are quite high and have gotten much higher recently. The median sales price last year was $895,000. The price per square foot was the third highest in the county. The rental costs were quite high. A one-bedroom apartment was, average cost was $2,400. There were no three-bedroom rentals listed. So if you're a family and you need rental housing in Sausalito, it's very difficult to find. Income characteristics, this just shows, of those income categories we're talking about, the occupations that fall within those categories. So the school teacher that was here that was saying, I am one of these lower income occupations. The median income for an elementary school teacher in Marin falls within even the lower end of that low income range. So these are the types of occupations that we're talking about. Briefly, if we look at an affordability gap, so the standard is not spending more than 30% of your income on housing cost. And if we look at that for the Marin County elementary school teacher that makes $66,000 a year, they can basically afford $1,665 a month. The actual housing cost for a one-bedroom apartment with utilities is $2,500. So that's a gap, a significant gap of $835 a month. We don't even look at the affordability gap for ownership because it is so large in terms of when you look at occupation types. But essentially, if you just took the top end of what a moderate income household would make, which again might be your firefighter occupation, there's a purchase gap of $329,000. So you're not going to see moderate income workforce occupations purchasing homes in town. So I got through that quickly, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff for next steps.
So as we mentioned, there'll be several more community meetings. That next council meeting shown on the postcard is just a check-in with the council to report back on the results of this community meeting. We'll be continuing to work with the Housing Element Subcommittee, which consists of 2 council members, 2 planning commissioners, I believe, and 1 or 2 at-large. And these 2 tracks will be running parallel, as shown in that slide. We'll be working on the draft housing element for the next cycle, and that next workshop in May, we'll be reporting back to this group in a similar setting to show you where we're at and the progress. Yes, sir.
Why aren't you just using the 144 buffer that you had in the previous cycles to fulfill the 79 required?
Well, essentially we are. We're reusing the sites we had last time. The only reason you wouldn't be able to use a site is if it had actually developed during the previous planning period. Then that site's like, okay, that's developed. It's off the list as a potential site because it's an actual housing development now. But anything that hasn't developed, and it's because it's been such a short time frame, most of those sites are still in the same state they were before. So yeah, we are not looking to expand the scope of that list at all.
Also notice in that presentation there that you use one individual per household instead of 2 to use those finance numbers. So weren't the other things based on 2-person households?
When we're using an example of what an occupation earns, you're using a 1 person, just as an example.
But the definition, if I remember seeing on one of the slides, was income available as far as qualifications was a 2-person household. And your examples were all 1-person household, 1 salary household.
It can be looked
Isn't that
at.
a little contradictory?
It can be looked at in a number of different ways.
And just as an observation, to see the population of Sausalito drop by 4%, what the hell are we doing adding more residences, housing elements to the city? It makes absolutely no sense.
Well, as you know, the RENA has been adopted by ABAG, so there's no going back on that.
Yep.
And it's quite a bit lower, so we have the benefit of, again, reusing what we've done. While we had the buffer last time, we didn't have the buffer in the very low income. So it's not like we can take away sites that were multifamily because we don't have the very low income buffer.
I just can't believe that. I've lived here for 23 years. I'm general contractor, land developer, everything else. And I remember when I first moved here, I had this guy come through me while I was standing in line at the art festival, wanting me to sign a petition, no more construction in Sausalito, which I refused to sign. Obviously, I was in the business. Now I'm finding myself 23 years later standing here saying, what is going on here? You're talking about more development? I'm now finding myself on the other side saying, stop. I don't want any more development in Sausalito. We already have too much traffic. We already have no parking. We already have all sorts of problems. And by the way, counting the homeless, they're all transitional. One day they're here or they're walking through. I don't know where you can come up with these figures as far as homeless people. But thank you for the presentation.
Quick question. All these questions that were raised, are you going to write those down and send them out by email to us that have been here?
We'll give them to the city council.
Typically, we would forward that type of information through the public materials back to the Planning Commission and Council. So if you track that process and get on that email list, it would go back to you.
The reason I asked that question is I have asked you 3 questions prior, and you have not answered those questions yet. So I think it's important that we, the people, have those sent to us so that when we go to the city council or the planning commission, we can address these things that have not been addressed.
But you've had some questions that had in the beginning that haven't been answered?
That's right.
You want to give us another shot at it?
The first question I asked you about was the requirement on the handicap as to what was going to be required in this aspect.
Is that for the reasonable accommodation ordinance?
The reasonable accommodation ordinance. What are you going to require in it?
It lays out a framework whereby the city, if they receive an application for a request for reasonable accommodation, which is a concept well established, it's not something we made up, it's well established in state and federal law. If they can make a request in writing and explain why they need a accommodation of the local rules to accommodate their particular.
Now, is that the owner of the property, or is that somebody
that could be
anybody can make?
That could be the owner or a renter of a residential property could request that.
Okay, well, let's say it's an owner of the property and he's renting it out, and the renter asks for the accommodations. Who's got to pay for that?
Typically, that'd be between the owner and the renter to negotiate. The city ordinance wouldn't address that.
Does that answer his question?
The other two?
Does that help?
What were your other 2 questions?
Oh, the other one, the zoning. You talk about rezoning in the area where currently it says that you can have either in your vertical, you can either have commercial or you can have residential on the 2nd floor. And you're talking about now that you're going to make it mandatory that it has to be residential. I think you're overstepping your bounds on the constitutional aspect of telling the property owner what he can do with that 2nd level and taking away what he bought the property at currently. I see a lot of holes in this plan all the way down.
I see that more as a comment than a question, so I don't have to answer it.
Which is a third question? Yeah.
One more question from the gentleman?
No, let's-
You have a third question? Okay. Yes, sir.
I took advantage of the accessory dwelling unit amnesty and got part of my house approved as an accessory dwelling unit. Now, it's not something that I've rented out for more than 15 years, and I have no intention of ever renting it out again. I did it in part to preserve the right to do it and to help address this housing issue. I have a kind of a stupid question here. We have, actually, I think we are already in compliance with the housing plan, because with all the illegal second units that are already existing in Sausalito. Why don't we make the process much easier to approve the second dwelling unit? Exempt it from a lot of the code stuff, eliminate the fees, do everything humanly possible to encourage people to come out and declare those units, make it an absolutely yes-full proposition. You can easily address a lot of these issues that are very expensive for the city, very impactful on people, by simply changing the rules to recognize the situation that already exists. Why aren't we doing that? I mean, I had to pay a $400 fee, I had to submit plans, I got to go through all sorts of inspection. I did it. But the point is, it was much, much harder than it needs to be, and if we recognized everything that was done illegally here, I believe we'd be problem solved. Why not do that? And that would impact anybody, and everybody would be happy.
The short answer to that is we kind of tried that the first go around. We went real heavy with the liveaboards and the second units, new second units and amnesty second units. We went real big on the numbers, and we got a lot of pushback from HCD. That's the folks in Sacramento, the housing department in Sacramento that certifies the housing element. And their concern was that even if we were able to achieve all those projections, another underlying requirement of the housing element process is that you provide a diversity of housing types. Small apartments, one-bedroom apartments, two bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, family-sized units, provide a broad spectrum. So with that requirement, we kind of hit the end of the line on all the really small units that we had in our plan. But I agree with you that if the city agrees at a local level, they want to make it easier for people to legalize illegal units, which is an inherent good in its own right, to bring those units into the fold of safe, habitable housing that's been inspected and approved by the city, and the fire department knows that someone's out there. If there's a fire in the middle of the night, that's just good public policy. But it may not get you as far as you would think with some of the other more global requirements.
It sounds like you have to chip away at it. But
absolutely.
My feedback to the city is, even though I went through the process and I'm very organized and I did it and it was okay, there's a lot of people I know, particularly elderly people or people who don't have as much time as I do or haven't gone through these kind of complicated processes before, who are going to be put off by the fact, by how complicated it was, and they're going to be put off by having to write checks. Why not make it free? Make it really, really, really easy and recognize everything. Boom. And at least we'll chip away at that way.
We, in administering the amnesty program, we have approved every application for an amnesty accessory dwelling unit that has been submitted is on its way to be approved. So we've not turned any down.
I disagree.
Can I finish?
Yes.
We tried to apply.
So in terms of the inspections that you asked about, those are a bare minimum safety inspection. For it to be a housing unit, the city has an inherent responsibility to make sure that unit is safe to work in, or safe to live in. And so, for example, there cannot be bare electrical wires there. And so you grimace at that a little bit, but that's what our building inspector goes out as part of his inspection of these amnesty units to make sure is not there. And he has found that. And so on those particular amnesty units, even though they may have been in effect as an illegal unit for the last 15 years, it may have been an unsafe situation. The water heater, ventilation for a gas water heater may not have been vented. That's an unsafe situation. So yes, even if we are going to try to take credit for these unpermitted accessory dwelling units, we do have a bare minimum of safety we have to
to ensure is there. And so, yes, there are inspections that have to take place. I cannot ignore that. That would be not, I don't think you would want that, the city to be having that kind of a public policy.
Then don't make people pay for it either.
Well,
I mean,
I think our fees were $400.
I wrote a check for, hey, you know, for some people, for somebody who's on Social Security, for me, I don't care, that's nothing.
Right.
For somebody who's on Social Security, that's a lot of money. And don't make them fill out extensive paperwork, or send someone to fill it out for them, but do everything humanly possible to make it a yesable proposition. Don't make me go down to the, don't make me go, oh, one of the big issues is you have to have plans. Well, fortunately, I had plans, and I would go down to Kinko's and I copied, you know, these big plans to submit them along with the application.
We have to know what we're approving.
Then go and send someone to
Well,
look at
okay,
it.
well, I'm sorry you disagree. You feel unhappy with the way we administered the program.
No, because
We administered it in its most efficient way as possible, and we have not turned anyone down. So I think it has been an effective
If
program.
you made it easier, you'd probably get another probably 5, 10, 15 units out.
So you had a question?
Yes, we live on Cloudview Road, and we tried to get this permit, and we were told we needed so much off-street parking.
Was that an amnesty unit or a new one?
An amnesty unit, so much off-street parking. I don't know what is it, 15 and a half feet you need? What is it?
For an amnesty unit, you wouldn't have to provide
You
parking.
said off-street, you would have to have off-street parking.
Not for an illegal unit.
You turned us down.
Well, why don't we talk about this offline and make sure that...
Okay, we'll come back, because
Well,
you
we
were
can
turned
tell
down.
you better than that. You don't have to come back. We'll talk about it before the end of today.
Plans and everything.
Yes, ma'am.
Since some of this is theoretical, the spaces, was any consideration given to people sharing rentals? Because I live at Wick Spring, just a few far from here. We have a lot of condos there. And I know some people that couldn't afford to pay all by themselves, and they have a 2-bedroom unit, and so they share, or if they own it, they rent out part of it, which isn't an accessory dwelling unit, but they are sharing the cost, so that a teacher or a firefighter or someone who was low income could live there and pay less than the $1,666. I mean, that's a possibility. I know people are doing it. Was that taken into consideration?
Yeah, we have a policy encouraging co-housing or house sharing, and a lot of cities do that, and a lot of people do that, obviously, because it makes sense. But the inevitable follow-up question is, you know, do we get credit for that? You know, does that count towards meeting our housing goals? And unfortunately, the answer is no, because within the housing context, we're really looking for additional units, and we find that in an environment where there's not enough units, people will start sharing housing, all the way to the other extreme where it becomes overcrowding, and that becomes even more of a reason, you know, to provide more actual units. And so new units are defined as anything that has its own independent cooking facility. So if a house were to be converted into a duplex, which we see a little bit here in Sausalito, or quite a bit of actually in Sausalito, where 2 families might buy a house and then convert it into a duplex, that would count as one new unit.
I would like to know if the end game, and I'm addressing this to any city council people here, the eventual end game will be rent control. Because if you can't force people to build more units in the city, and you're objecting to what it costs to live in the city for certain income brackets, I conclude that that's going to eventually be the outcome.
It's a good question, and my personal opinion is HCD is actually very sensitive to market issues, and they would actually view that as a serious constraint on the provision of new housing, for example. Like if in a very strict rent control environment, the classical economic argument is people aren't going to build new apartments if they know they're going to be subject to a very strict rent control program. And so HCD might look to you and say, how are you going to justify that based on a constraint on market rate development, which we talk a lot about affordable housing, but the whole program also tries to lay out a structure where there can be enough market rate housing too. And so if you go too heavy on the affordable side, then it comes back to, well, what are you doing to protect the market from all these affordable restrictions you put in place?
Right, but we just saw the sad story about people make a certain amount of money and they can only afford a certain amount. And we all know that, number one, properties is expensive today as it ever has been. Construction costs are as expensive today as they've ever been, so on and so forth. So therefore, to develop any of these properties, they're going to be at the higher end of what the rentals are demanding and so on and so forth. So these people will never catch up.
The short answer is this is the fact of the first meeting that I've been attended on the housing element where I've heard the topic of rent control. The short answer is no. That is not on the table at all. Absolutely not.
When you say end game, I assumed you were thinking like 10 or 20 years from now. Yeah, like long, big picture, right? Way out here?
Right.
Yeah,
in other words, when do the dictates from the state eventually end? And if it doesn't work, and these people can't afford the rents that are being charged in the city, the only other thing I see is some type of force put on property owners to provide their properties at lesser cost to the individuals. And by the way, it was a very sad thing about how much some of these people are making. But when I was younger, you know, we doubled, tripled up in a place, and therefore you divide your costs into half or a third or whatever it is, and that's the way you live. When I moved to Marin County, I wanted to live in Mill Valley, couldn't afford it, and we kept driving until we could afford it, and that's how we ended up in the bottle the first time when we got here. So, you know, I don't know. I see these sad stories.
Well, the funny thing is everyone looks at that slide and sees something different. To me, that slide represents, the median income in this county is very high, right? Over $100,000 a year. I think we can all agree that's pretty high.
I don't know where they're getting all this money.
That's one of the highest. That's one of the highest in the country. And then when you start breaking that down by income levels, those are still decent incomes.
Yeah. Right.
Right? For young people coming out of school and getting jobs.
Right. So what drove up the costs in Marin County?
Right.
No construction restrictions all over the place. Now you're going the exact opposite direction.
Oh, we haven't had a question.
Yeah, this is going on in so many communities in Marin, and has there been any traffic studies? Because traffic has gotten so bad, like just getting on the highway sometimes, or even some of our streets. Is anything being looked at or studied?
Well, this group might not like this answer, but one of the purposes of linking the planning with the transportation, we talked about ABAG and MTC, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, so that some of that transportation planning can be done more effectively, because absent some linkage between where people live and where people work, it's very hard to have a functioning transportation system without just constantly, building more and more freeways, which we've sort of reached the limit of what we can physically fit in and what we can afford to pay for, and what environmentally, people are willing to live with. So the idea from a global perspective, and I'm not arguing it's being implemented here in Sausalito, because I would argue it's not based on these numbers, but from a Bay Area-wide perspective, the idea is to put the bulk of the housing near those major job centers, so you don't have to build a new freeway from some outlying area where the people are living into the job centers, which are in the close-in areas. And if you want to read more on that subject, I'd point you to no jeering, please. But ABAG's website has the one Bay Plan Area plan on it, which is an actual plan to talk about housing and transportation and how that'll work over the next 20, 30 years in the Bay Area.
But Strawberry had the same issues, and I understand a lot of people finally got it off the table. They're not doing what they're planning on doing.
The Strawberry in the county?
Yeah.
With those PDA issues.
So we're over our time limit. I suggest we end the official meeting and break into a small group format. I'll take this half, and Jeremy can take that half.
I like to hear what everybody has to say.
You guys want
to break up?
You guys want to keep talking?
Yeah. I think it's pretty obvious everybody's like to keep talking.
Okay. Well, if just to anyone who wants to leave, you feel free to leave, because don't want to keep you beyond the advertised time. Anyone who wants to stay, please stay.
Jeff,
And
can you mention, hang on. If you're not on my mailing list, email me. My cards are at the front, and there's a postcard at the front when you walked in, and you'll get an email from me every time we have a meeting. I'll send you links to staff reports where you can get more information.
Okay, and before we break up too, anybody that wants to be part of the neighborhood association, HB Street and Spring Street, you can sign it. Give me your email address.
What are the dues?
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.